Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's discussion on the State of the Union 100 days into the Biden presidency. Ever since President Franklin Roosevelt took office in the dark days of the Great Depression in 1933, the first 100 days have marked the apex of a new U.S. leader's power and often the most prolific period for policy wins. So I'm thrilled to have four of America's leading journalists with us tonight to discuss the challenges that President Biden is facing, including the pandemic and vaccine access, widespread unemployment, the need for economic recovery, divisions across government and our nation, and wins that President Biden has managed to attain, as well as losses in his first 100 days in office. So in the first months of his presidency, President Biden signed the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan in an effort to change the course of the COVID-19 pandemic and aid the country's recovery from the crisis. In addition to this first big piece of legislation, he has introduced plans for sweeping immigration reform and massive infrastructure investment to Congress. Americans have given President Biden mostly positive marks for his first 100 days, although there are huge gaps in support based on political party. As we all know, there are many differences between America's two main political parties, but the most fundamental is perhaps that Democrats say government can and should act boldly to improve people's lives and strengthen the nation with a focus on bigger government. On the other hand, Republicans insist that government itself poses the greatest threat to individual liberty and the nation's lasting competitive strength. The pandemic has given President Biden an opportunity to show government can go big, historically big. This debate over government's proper role in America has raged since the early days of the Republic, and that argument will no doubt continue. Biden has months, not years, to make his case for a more activist federal government because Republicans are waiting in the wings. So it's an honor to introduce our panel who will help us evaluate these critical issues tonight. First, I'd like to also thank the Princeton Club of New York for sponsoring this program and Princeton Association of New York City and Conscious Capitalism for being co-sponsors, as well as my co-host, Rob Walk. Mark Fisher is a senior editor at the Washington Post, where he reports and leads coverage of national, foreign, and local issues. His reporting in recent years has taken him from the Arab Spring revolutions to the presidential campaign trail. In 2016, he co-authored a biography of Donald Trump, Trump Revealed, an American journey of ambition, ego, money, and power, which was a New York Times bestseller. He's won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for reporting. And in 2020, he was part of a group of Post staffers whose coverage of mass shootings was a finalist for the Pulitzer in breaking news. He lives in Washington, D.C., and is a 1980 graduate of Princeton University with an honors degree in history. Ramesh Ponnuru is senior editor for National Review, a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion, a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and a senior fellow at the National Review Institute. In fall 2013, he was a resident fellow at the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics. He also graduated from Princeton's History Department, summa cum laude. Ponnuru has published articles in numerous publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, Newsday, and the New York Post. Jennifer Epstein is a correspondent who covered the Biden campaign for Bloomberg News, and she covers the White House. She also covered the 2012 Obama campaign and general politics. She previously worked for Inside Higher Ed and Time Magazine. She's also a graduate of Princeton, where she majored in history. There is something about Princetonians majoring in history going into journalism, I think. And she was managing editor of the Daily Princetonian. Rick Klein is political director for ABC News, also based in Washington. He oversees the political unit and helps steer the network's coverage of major news events. He provides regular political commentary and analysis for all ABC News broadcasts and platforms, including World News Tonight, Good Morning America, abcnews.com, ABC News Radio, and News One, the network's affiliate news service. So Mark, Jennifer, Ramesh, and Rick will speak for about 45 to 50 minutes, and then they'll answer your questions for 15 to 20. So again, please remember to click on the Q&A tab and write your questions in the box, and we'll get to as many as we can. President Joe Biden set out his agenda for a transformation in the role of government in the lives of Americans through trillions of dollars in spending. In a speech last week to a joint session of Congress on the eve of his 100th day in office, he called for a new era of government spending, saying, "We can't stop now." I'd welcome your thoughts on his speech, which focused both on economic policy predominantly and has been cited as both an effort toward bipartisanship and also as a populist progressive speech. Mark, why don't we start with you?
Okay, thanks, Wendy. Appreciate the introduction. The Biden speech was really quite fascinating, and unfortunately, wasn't seen by all that many people. It was I think it was the smallest audience for a presidential address in some years. Certainly, it was smaller than any of Trump's major addresses, and yet it was something that people could have learned from, because it showed us the old Joe Biden and a new Joe Biden all mixed together. And so you had the classic old Joe Biden, who was creature of Congress, creature of the Senate, who was essentially talking to the country as if we were kind of bystanders. As he spoke to the senators, it was like a visit to a clubhouse in that sense. So that was classic old Joe. But then mixed in there was this really soft-spoken guy who was not the sort of verbose blowhard we've come to know through the decades, but rather was someone who was trying to present himself as maybe retiring isn't quite the right word, but certainly not someone who was trying to win hearts and minds through his charisma, but rather through his policies and his being different from the other guy. And that setting of contrasts, I think, is what the speech was primarily about, along with the idea that we need to go big with government. So I thought it was a successful speech in as much as he was communicating this sense of calm, this notion of a return to normalcy that was at the heart of his campaign. It was not a successful speech in winning over a whole lot of people. I can't imagine there were many people who said, "Oh, goodness, the government really should do a whole lot more if they thought otherwise." So I think it's a harbinger of things to come, in as much as he's going to be a president who defines himself in part by what the other guy didn't do. And it's also going to be a harbinger of the fact that he realizes he's not going to get any significant Republican support in the Congress. And if he's going to get anywhere, he's going to have to do it through support from the American people.
Thank you. Ramesh, what are your thoughts about the speech?
So I think that the low ratings are, in a fundamental sense, connected to the kind of return to normalcy theme that Mark was talking about. I think one of the things that is buoying Biden is the sense that, well, we don't have to pay as close attention. This will not be the story of this presidency will not be kind of zany or occasionally harrowing as the Trump administration was. And so I'm sure that Biden would have preferred a lot more people watching it, but I do think that these things are sort of a package deal, and people feel free not to pay close attention. And so I think that the speech, we've been talking about sort of the artificiality of the 100-day marker. I think this speech is going to end up not being a particularly significant moment in the Biden presidency. It's not going to, I think, drive any political trends. This is, nobody's going to go back and say, well, this was an inflection point in the Biden presidency.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to another question for Jennifer and Rick, but if you want to also comment on this, feel free. So President Biden has focused almost entirely on two priorities: COVID vaccinations and economic recovery. His focus on the pandemic has helped the United States become a vaccine success story, first getting the COVID relief plan through Congress. So he has received the highest marks for his handling of the coronavirus pandemic, with 64% of adults, including 33% of Republicans, giving him positive ratings. And he promised at the start of his presidency to have at least 100 million Americans vaccinated by his 100th day in office, which at the time seemed a rather lofty goal. But by his 100th day in office, actually 220 million Americans had been vaccinated. So let's start with you, Jennifer. What are your thoughts? How is President Biden doing with regard to the COVID pandemic?
Well, that has been one of the extreme focuses of this administration, was on getting these shots into arms. It was both getting the shots distributed and then doing what the administration could to encourage the distribution of them, and really they were working primarily in this first 100 days on the people who were low friction, the people who wanted to get the shot, who were waiting to get the shot, were counting down to when their age group was eligible, those kinds of people. Now we're talking a little bit more about the next stage of trying to get those hesitant people. There's also, the other kind of piece of the spectrum, which is potentially this FDA approval for 12 to 16-year-olds coming as soon as next week for the Pfizer vaccine. But really, it has been about this vaccine goal, because that is how the Biden team sees the country moving ahead, moving on to the next stage. It's where the economic growth will come from, is that the country can reopen to the extent that where it was closed, it can, there's some places where it never really closed down, but just that there will be more economic activity as people are leaving their homes more frequently and socializing more and doing all those things that people haven't been doing for the past 13 months, 14 months. And so that's really been where much of the administration's focus has been. And it all gets back to the economic recovery, which is inextricably linked to the virus and to the number of cases going down nationally.
Rick, what are your thoughts? Thanks, Jennifer.
Yeah, I mean, the view of Biden's advisors, as Jennifer references, is that nothing else is going to matter if they don't get COVID right, and that's not a bad bet if you think about the circumstances under which he became president and the historic nature of this moment. And similar to Ramesh's point earlier about how the ratings are connected to this return to normalcy, all of this is connected as well. I mean, if COVID is handled right, then yes, you get economic recovery, and you buy maybe enough goodwill to get some other things done, and to reorder, to realign the fundamental relationship between government and its people. And that's the goal. There was a headline the other day that called Biden the anti-Reagan in that sense. And I think that's where he's going more broadly and sees an opportunity. He also had an interesting comment that he made to a group of the network anchors on the day of the State of the Union. Part of it was off the record, but one of the on the record comments was that there are things that he feels like he are worth losing, and he viewing his moment as big enough that he feels like there are priorities that he's putting forward, prepared to lose some. I mean, he's pretty realistic about the Senate prospects. I thought one line in the speech last week that struck me was, him saying, I welcome these conversations, I welcome these ideas, but make no mistake, and he slowed down the speech to say it, inaction is not an option. And, he doesn't even have all the Democrats, much less any Republicans on board for the infrastructure plan. So good luck with that. But I think it was a signal, like he's gonna be that Joe for a little while, but he's going to be another kind of person. He views himself in much loftier terms, views this moment as a lot bigger than a typical presidency, even the presidencies that he's served under over the last 50 years or so in Washington. And he sees it as a very big moment. And the opportunity to communicate that and to start to turn that into real action, I think is what energizes this White House. And yeah, I think a lot of people have been surprised by how bold he's been, how progressive, how liberal he's been out of the box. But that's, I think it's in keeping of the through line of looking at this moment as bigger than the sum of even all of these historical challenges and forces that you've outlined.
Thank you. And that's a great segue to my next question, which is that President Biden, fresh off his victory on the large stimulus package, has proposed a $2.3 trillion infrastructure and jobs bill and the so-called American Families Plan, a $1.8 trillion investment, which includes both tax breaks and deep investment in education. So the big COVID relief package sailed through, raising the idea that Biden's other big ticket legislation might also go somewhere. But Mark, you've indicated, and I think Rick just alluded to this right now, that this appears to be mostly wishful thinking. So taken together, his three major economic policies, the emergency spending bill, the infrastructure plan, and this latest family plan, represent a massive boost in government investment in the economy. Which of his initiatives do you think really have a chance of getting through, and what does he actually have to accomplish to have any prayer of keeping a Democratic majority in either the House or the Senate next year? So Mark, I'd love your thoughts on that. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. I think the safest and probably most accurate response to that question is he's not going to get anything through that includes the word trillion in it. And whether that's infrastructure or family plan or anything else, I think there is an appetite for some compromise, perhaps. I was talking for a story last week to Newt Gingrich, who said he thinks there will be deals on infrastructure and immigration. Of course, lots of people like Newt Gingrich have said that in the past, and nothing ever happens. Immigration is the great bellwether on these kinds of big packages, because that's the one where everyone says, boy, it really could happen, because there are people on both sides who want it to, and the two sides are not that far apart on policy, but they are very apart on rhetoric, and they are very far apart on the culture wars, and they are very far apart in their perception of the electorate. And therefore, I don't see any big deal happening. And obstructionism still rules the day on the Republican side, as long as Mitch McConnell's around, and as long as the party itself remains as divided as it is within itself. So I think you may see some limited compromise and agreement on real infrastructure, on roads and bridges and broadband, but I don't think you'll see the massive package that Biden has proposed. I think what's happening here is that the Democrats obviously have not the greatest hopes of holding on to their majority next year, but whatever hopes they have will hinge less, I think, on legislation or even on inflation as on Biden's ability to temper the left of his own party, and particularly to temper the rhetoric on race and gender and the culture wars. I thought the comments that James Carville made last week were very important about how Democrats know they have a wokeness problem. And what that means is they may agree on the merits of some of those issues, but they, at some level, some openly, some not so openly, see that they have a rhetoric issue, and that they are giving the Republicans way too much in terms of raw meat that they can use to rile people up against them. And so Republicans will keep on running on transgender athletes and what Carville called faculty lounge politics. And I think Democrats are at some level quite aware of that, and they haven't figured out how to deal with it. But I think you heard some of Biden's approach in that speech last week, where he was quite affirmatively not going there, and some of the same language that we're hearing, that has gone from college campuses to workplaces to Democratic politics.
Ramesh, what are your thoughts on this?
If you think about what Biden can accomplish, he can make regulatory changes through the administration, although those will be subject to review from a judiciary that is significantly more conservative than the one that greeted Barack Obama in 2009. He has been able to get some spending, and he will be able to get some nominations, including judicial nominations, through, and maybe change that balance of the courts over time. But it's interesting that Mark is so skeptical that some of these additional spending items are going to pass, because I think that's pretty much it. I mean, if you think about the other items that Biden has talked about, I just have a really hard time seeing how we can possibly get them. So whether you're talking about, we've already seen the $15 minimum wage die, the Equality Act, DC statehood, a ban on assault weapons, anything that requires either, that has to get 60 votes to pass the Senate, or would require changing the filibuster rules in order to pass with a smaller majority, I don't see happening. And I think immigration is not really likely to lead to a bargain for a number of reasons. I don't think either party, in a way, is sort of is positioned. I mean, both parties have moved further apart on that issue. I think Biden's bill is significantly to the left of the previous bills that didn't pass Congress, and so it's less likely to get congressional support. And then, if you look at the polling, there is increasing concern about the situation at the southern border. An increasing number of voters are inclined to think that it's a big problem and that it's being mishandled by the Biden administration. That's not the kind of circumstance that's going to lead Republicans to want to make a deal with the Democrats.
Thank you. So Joe Biden won office by promising a return to normalcy and a restoration of bipartisanship. Does his approach to Congress and government management point towards a return to normalcy to Washington? How's he doing on those promises? Jennifer, let's start with you.
Well, I think he in some ways has returned to or done something that a lot of members of Congress have told me is new for them, which is to be invited to the White House regardless of their political party. There have been lots of Republicans, although they're mostly more toward the center of the political spectrum, who've been invited there. As of last week, on the 100th day, the White House said that they had 130 members of Congress at the White House already. Interestingly, that did not include Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell or House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. They will both be at a meeting with Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi mid-month, just the big four leaders with the president and vice president. But I do think it is notable that the president has tried to start seeding relationships. One we're seeing now on infrastructure is with Shelley Moore Capito, the other senator from West Virginia. If there's so much attention on Joe Manchin as sort of that 50th vote on a lot of things on the Democratic side, Biden is actually working with his counterpart right now, because she is the top Republican on a related committee. But I think that we're also in a different era, and Biden spent a lot of time during the campaign, sort of at least before the pandemic, talking about how there would be an epiphany among Republicans once Trump was out of the way, and that they would come to see that they could work with him in some form. Now, when he got a question on this, which I think was from George Stephanopoulos from ABC, he a couple of weeks ago, he said, well, just give me time. Like I'm going to still be able to win over Republicans because of how popular some of my policies are. It's not going to be every single Republican on every single issue, but there are going to be places where we can work together. Now, I do think that's a little bit different from what his promise was, which did sound a lot like I'm going to be making deals with Mitch McConnell all the time. But there are some of these attempts which are different than what the Trump administration did by and large, although there were some areas on criminal justice, for instance, where there was some work with Democrats, but that was very limited. We do see Biden, I think that this first package, one, this administration wanted a big win off the bat. Two, they did see the urgency of these issues and the need to get money out for vaccinations, for reopening schools, those kinds of things. And that's why they didn't really work that hard to get Republicans on board. And by early February, we're already, encouraging the congressional leaders of the Democrats to go it alone on this. But I think that you will see these at least attempts to reach out to Republicans, but the Republicans are reaching out to are a very, divided and complicated group of people at this time. You have, you just seeing what's been going on with Congresswoman Cheney. You see just this dynamic that's happening where there are different versions of even how the last election turned out that are still very much driving the party forward. And, how can the Biden administration even make a deal with somebody who doesn't acknowledge that Biden won the election?
Thank you. That's a really great perspective on partisanship that's going on right now. And Rick, I'd like to kind of take it in a slightly different angle with you now. So Biden's popularity among independents and, of course, Democrats is strikingly strong. But despite his claims that Republican voters are also coming along with his programs, the polls show clearly that's not the case. Tim Scott, when he delivered the GOP rebuttal to the president's speech last week, accused Biden of abandoning bipartisanship. And there's a huge gap in polls in terms of support for Biden, with 96% of Democrats supporting the president and only 10% of Republicans. So, Rick, I'd love to know your thoughts about this. Is President Biden spending too much energy on satisfying the left wing of his party rather than reaching out to Republicans who might be willing to edge away from Trump?
Yeah, so I think some of the polling, I don't know if this is specifically you had in mind, but ABC Washington Post poll to coincide with 100 days had the Biden approval rating, I think, at 52%, which is 10 points higher than Donald Trump, but 14 points higher than the average of all presidents since modern polling, since World War II, essentially. The only Trump and Gerald Ford had lower approval ratings 100 days in. And Barack Obama was in the high 60s. And it was fascinating to me to look back at some of the numbers that George H.W. Bush, Ronald Reagan got. They were well into the 60s in approval rating among Democrats, just Democrats. And, I don't think that's possible anymore. And I think, 52 might be the new 65. Like the same way that I think we saw President Trump explore the bottom reaches or the bottom depths of what polling could bring you, where you're down to really the a third of the country or so that would approve of him. I think you're going to see maybe in this president exploring what the new upper limits are. I don't expect, and frankly don't think Joe Biden expects either in this climate, that you're going to see much of an opportunity to go, to get Democrats on board, anything like former administrations were able to do. It's just a different era. It's a different time. And I actually think Biden, there is a push-pull inside of him. Does he want to be that guy that was in the Senate and cutting deals, or does he want to be this transformational figure, or is it some combination because of the circumstances? He remembers the Obama years, and one of the main liberal progressive critiques of Obama is that he spent so much time courting Republicans that he forgot about what made him a Democrat, and ended up squandering what ended up being a very short-lived majority. And is the Biden team just going strong now, thinking either we're going to lose this majority anyway, so let's go for broke, or we have to make this case to the American people that we stand for these things, or we know we're going to lose, as Biden alluded to, on some of these areas. So I don't read that number of 52% as a bad number. It's certainly a lot better than the previous president. And he governed without Democrats at the table almost at all. And the thinking is, okay, the roles are reversed. Now, there's a couple different factors. One is the majorities are slimmer than they were for Trump, slimmer really than any president's ever had in terms of a 50-50 Senate, and the ability to lose only 2 or 3 votes in the House. You also have the fact that he did campaign a little bit differently and was and had those expectations. But I just don't believe, and I don't think the Biden team really truly believes, that this would have been a time of a lot of bipartisanship and a lot of aisle crossing. No matter how many meetings or how many concessions you make, there are deals to be cut, like there are always deals to be cut. There's some areas that he's never going to get Republicans to deal with. I think he's pretty realistic about that. I think for now, at least, they see more value in delivering on campaign promises and delivering for progressives, and at least asking initially for bigger numbers than in trying to negotiate, when the example of Obama is that there may not be any negotiating that exists. You may not ever be able to get Republicans meaningfully to any table, no matter how much you concede.
So some journalists and politicians, as we said at the outset tonight, have said that Biden's presidency is shaping up to be transformative in the style of FDR and LBJ. But unlike Roosevelt in the 1930s and Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, Democrats, as you've shared, have razor-thin majorities in both houses of Congress. Both FDR and LBJ won in landslide elections, as well as having Democrats control both the House and Senate. So the dissimilarity between political situations really couldn't be starker. Mark, what are your thoughts on these two issues? Is President Biden's start to his presidency really reminiscent of FDR and LBJ? And then Ramesh, I'd love your thoughts on this as well.
A friend of mine once said that journalists are actually analogists, who are always looking for analogies to other periods, other players. And certainly in Biden's case, there's been this search for, is he really the next FDR? Is he the next Lyndon Johnson? I wrote a piece last week looking at this whole question of normalcy, and I focused in on his similarities and differences to Gerald Ford and Warren Harding. So Harding came into office on the heels of a worldwide pandemic, a world war, economic displacement, and said his main campaign promise was, I want to bring you back to normalcy. And Ford, similarly, although he wasn't elected, came into office after this terrible national trauma of the disgrace of Richard Nixon. So in some ways, Biden follows them more logically than he follows Roosevelt or Johnson. He may have the ambitions of a Lyndon Johnson in wanting to show that government can be big and bold and effective. But I think the political situation he faces is much more analogous to Ford and to Harding. I presented that notion to a couple of people I trust in DC, and they came back and said, no, the right analogy is actually to Reagan following Carter, because again, you had the country deeply divided and in economic trouble, and in came Reagan, and he with Morning in America. And Biden, I think, has that same challenge as far as America's role in the world. The years of under Trump, this sense of disgrace or desecration of American interest around the world, and I think you'll see a significant focus from him on that. So I think stylistically, there's a lot to be said for Biden's possibility of restoring some sense of normalcy, restoring sort of doing as Roosevelt and Johnson did, and thinking boldly and acting boldly and speaking boldly. But as you mentioned in the question, I don't think he has the political basis on which to bring about the massive changes in society that Roosevelt and Johnson brought. I think the country is ready for significant action. The elections of Obama and Trump made that very clear. People want real change. They want dramatic change. And it's kind of counterintuitive that Joe Biden would be the guy to do that. But he now seems to want to do it. I just don't quite see how that happens.
Ramesh, what are your thoughts about this?
So let me start first with the world. I'll tell you the thing that most worries me when I look at the foreign policy situation, and that is the possibility of a confrontation with China with respect to Taiwan, which, that's something that is not in Biden's total control, or any president's, and would really, I think, make a hash of any kind of campaign theme of normalcy. That would sort of, the disruption of that theme would be the least of our problems, but I do think that is something that's quite worrisome. On the domestic front, I think that the comparison to FDR and LBJ is frankly ridiculous. And I mean, he's not FDR, he's not LBJ. I don't think he's even Obama in a certain sense, right? I mean, think about the first 2 years of the Obama administration, in terms of permanent changes to American law. You had the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the military. You had Obamacare, which turned out to have staying power. You had the Dodd-Frank regulation of the financial sector, and I just don't think we have the Lilly Ledbetter Act. Even I don't think you're going to get anything like such legislation through this Congress. Again, I think what you can get is a lot of spending, but even a lot of that spending is, I think, time limited spending. It's not permanent programs for the most part. Now, the idea that we're going to get the child's credit or child allowance made permanent, there's a possibility that happens. Although I think if that were really likely, you'd have to see some Republican buy-in, which would probably mean some pretty significant modification of those plans. I wonder, I mean, I'm not saying this is the most likely scenario, but I do think there is a kind of political worst case scenario where all of this hype about transformation and he's another FDR and it's full speed ahead and AOC is so happy, that all of that frightens Republican and conservative and even some independent voters, while at some point people on the left start noticing how much is actually not being delivered on that they want.
So on the other hand, we're living through unprecedented times now with the pandemic, and polling indicates that support for smaller government is at the lowest level since 1984. And a recent Washington Post ABC News poll found that high support for larger government among people under 40 and minorities, suggesting that perhaps there's a generational shift in what people want from government economic policy. So Rick, is the pandemic likely to have a profound impact on just how progressive President Biden can be?
I mean, I think the pandemic is going to have a profound impact on every aspect of American life and society in ways we can't even imagine. I mean, I think, depending on your stage of life and your stage of political awakeness or or your understanding of what's happening. I feel like I don't know that there's even a way to calculate it right now. What it fully means, and certainly the Biden presidency, I don't think will ever be able to be discussed by historians in any way, shape, or form without discussions of the pandemic. Same for Trump. I mean, it dominated. What a tumultuous. I forgot the word that Ramesh used, but it was, but it was a busy time. A lot happened in 3+ years before the pandemic, but then this once a century thing happens, and he's judged. Ultimately, I think has to be judged on his handling of it and his response to it, and then his handling of an election loss that he never and still has not accepted. And I think for Biden, his moment in history is going to be determined by this. And there's a hope among some Democrats that people are seeing government working right now, and they're getting a vaccination with National Guardsmen standing watch and helping out, and they're getting this helping hand from government, this miracle of science that was fostered by government, even bipartisan, because it started under Trump, and a lot of Trump administration initiatives helped lead to the development of the vaccines. And they're seeing this, and they're seeing the necessity of government lending a hand right now, and they're willing to accept something different. They're willing to say, okay, it's time to see government do more. And you combine that with some other generational trends you see, concerns around things like climate change, concerns about income inequality generally, concerns about LGBTQ rights, and you start to say, okay, there's a chance here for Democrats to really cement something. There's also a chance that they go down in utter flames around all of this, and there are historic midterm losses next year, and that the Biden presidency is remembered as kind of a blip for a conservative ascendancy. We don't know that yet, but I think to the earlier point about COVID, I mean, this moment, this pandemic is impacting everything. It's obviously impacting politics. It's obviously impacting the way that government can and does operate, and I think it's incalculable. The ultimate impact of this on our country and on politics.
Thank you. So I'd love to discuss the Democratic Party and where it's leaning, since this is a big function of President Biden's policy initiatives. Ramesh, you wrote that the reappraisal of Obama is also a function of the Democrats' continued movement left. Many Democrats have persuaded themselves that their political failures during Obama's term were the result of their not having been bold enough. So they believe that congressional Republicans would negotiate with them in good faith. And so now they say they advanced proposals that were far-reaching than they actually wanted. Politically, this strategy seems to be working, according to polling. The US stock market closed Biden's first 100 days in office with the strongest start to a presidential term since FDR in 1933. So this is encouraging Democrats to hope that their core voters will reward their boldness. On the other hand, Republicans' perceptions that Biden is too liberal has jumped from 46% in February 2020 to 80% today. So Jennifer, let's start with Jennifer. How will Biden be able to build consensus at this point and reach across the aisle for change? A number of people felt that the lack of a Democratic majority in Congress would actually incentivize the Biden presidency to take a more centrist position, but that doesn't really seem to be happening. So what are your thoughts, Jennifer? And then Ramesh, since you had written about this, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, well, one thing I would just point to as somebody who covered the Biden campaign very closely at a time when not a lot of people were paying attention to Joe Biden, which was honestly the entirety of the campaign, is that just about everything that he is proposing, everything that was in that speech last week, he proposed during the campaign. He had this multi-trillion-dollar package that he proposed last summer around infrastructure, the care economy, clean energy, and so on. Those things were all known. And if you go back even further to December 2019, I broke a story that was basically a breakdown of all the taxes that he was calling for, because Biden throughout the campaign from the very beginning in April 2019 was saying, I have these plans and I'm going to pay for them all, unlike my opponents who are saying that they're going to spend way more than me, 20, 30 trillion dollars, or the things that Sanders and Warren and even some of the others were talking about. But in those tax plans, he talked about capital gains. He talked about a minimum book tax. Those were all things that were there from the beginning. They were not, it was really funny when my colleagues reported on the capital gains tax plan, I guess the week before last, and the markets, it was a market moving story, and markets all tanked that afternoon, was that it was the exact same number, that 39.4% was the same number that Biden had put out there in December 2019, but it was just that the rest of the world wasn't paying attention to it. And so I say that because I think that connects with the fact that the center and the left of the Democratic Party are now, not the same, but they overlap quite a lot. And I think that, really saying that the center has moved to the left, and that creates, complications and challenges with dealing with Republicans. But I think, again, there is a calculation that has gone on by Biden and all of his advisors that there will be no way to have broad bipartisan consensus on issue after issue. That's just not the reality that we're in. And so, having learned the lessons of the Obama years and squandering those majorities that they had at the very beginning, they can't make that mistake again, and that they're betting that wins in the midterms can come from being bold, showing that they can deliver for the American people, because what other choice do they have? They can't really run toward the middle. Then they're going to lose more seats, or they're going to, end up back in the same position again. Just if you look at the map of the Senate races and so on. So they're really betting that moving to the left and doing what they can with 50 votes and the vice president breaking the tie if necessary, is going to be their way of getting some things done.
Ramesh, what are your thoughts about this?
So it's certainly true that there are fewer opportunities for bipartisan cooperation than there once were, given the way the parties have polarized and moved apart ideologically. But that's not true on every issue. So, for example, the parties were able to come together multiple times in 2020 on COVID relief. As recently as December, there was a very large bipartisan package on COVID relief that was clearly going to be to the political benefit of the incoming Biden administration. And one of the reasons why the Biden administration decided to go with a partisan strategy on its COVID relief bill was this theory that it was a huge mistake for Obama and the Democrats in 2009 to have gone too small on the stimulus of that year, and thus they didn't get the robust economic recovery that they could have, and that led to worse election results than they otherwise would have had. And I think this is a very questionable set of assumptions. Leaving aside sort of the economic policy question of whether more stimulus would have actually done all that much for the economy back then. The situations are just very different. In 2009, we had a very large output gap, and we had the aftermath of a financial crisis. Right now, we seem to be having a pretty robust recovery, and the size of the stimulus that was passed was much larger than any reasonable estimate of what the output gap is. So I do think that there's a little bit of a kind of generals fighting the last war kind of stuff. But then also, I think a bigger problem in 2009 and 2010 was that the public thought that Obama was moving too far, too fast to the left. That the Democratic losses were much larger that year than a pure econometric projection based on the state of the economy would have suggested, I think, largely because of that perception of overreach. And so it seems to me that they've learned the wrong lesson here, because they're not tempering the overreach, or at least the attempted overreach. They may not be able to actually overreach because they have such small margins. And meanwhile, they're doing all this spending that I think, is beginning to actually show up a little bit in the polls, and sort of plurality concern about all the spending. And that, arguably isn't particularly necessary.
Thank you. So I want to ask Mark one last question, and then we're going to go to a lightning round with all our panelists, and then to audience questions. So I just wanted to remind everyone, please click on the Q&A and put your questions there, and we will get to as many as we can. So Mark, some say Biden is taking a big gamble with the massive investments he's proposing. If his team's assumptions are correct that inflation can be kept under control while job options expand for many lower and middle class Americans, it will be a significant policy win. But one economist said the philosophy behind the Biden administration is everyone can have more. We can have the cake and eat it too. There's no price to pay in terms of inflation, higher interest rates, or slower growth. Is this true? Are we trying to have our cake and eat it too, with consequences down the road?
Absolutely, it's true. That's the nature of American politics. That's the nature of this country. If we've learned anything in the last 40, 50 years, it's that people can whine all they want about deficits, but nobody really thinks they're anything terribly bad. I think we've learned over the last 5 years that Republicans don't care about deficits anymore. Democrats never did. It was Mick Mulvaney, I think, who said nobody cares about deficits. So obviously there are serious potential for inflationary movement in the coming months. And we've had warnings from people like Larry Summers in recent weeks about that. But it doesn't seem to be a concern to either politicians or the American people. And I think politicians have learned, and Joe Biden is perhaps almost uniquely equipped to be a representative for the idea that if you just talk about things in a calm way, even if you're spending trillions of dollars, I think it was Andrew Yang of all people who said the other day that that everything that Biden does becomes the new reasonable just because of his age and gravity and manner, and we saw that in the speech the other night. So obviously the economy could take a turn toward the worse, but I think what history tells us is that we're in for some semblance of a roaring 20s kind of experience, both culturally and economically, and that can look lovely for a while, and it can have pretty awful results down the road. But I don't think we can count on either party to take a whole lot of responsibility in approaching what has to be done to prevent any crash.
Thank you. That's a really interesting insight. So now let's move to a lightning round, and let's start with Rick. If everybody could just say very briefly, what's your quick takeaway on the Biden presidency at 100 days? Start with Rick.
I got my Saturdays back. I feel like there's a normalcy to the rhythms of the place and expectations. I mean, there's definitely days where I think Washington reporters are, wondering what's missing from their lives in terms of the news cycles and the quickness of things. It's been deliberate. I feel like they planned out very, very, very carefully what the 100 days would look like. And I think they hit more marks than they missed. I think they have to feel pretty good about the first 100 days, whatever that leaves them moving forward. I think they have to feel pretty good about it.
Thank you. How about you, Jennifer?
Yeah, I think that the two core points for this administration in the first 100 days were widespread uptake of the vaccine and starting to get the economy moving a little bit more. And I think that they believe that they've been successful on both those fronts. I think their 100 million shots in the first 100 days they knew was a low ball estimate. And so, it was built for them to exceed it. And I think that on the economy, we'll see the April jobs numbers on Friday, but we're already seeing just in the weekly unemployment filings that those numbers are going down a bit. And so, those are kind of low bars to clear of kind of the minimum things, but they're also very much the maximum, and the things that matter most to the American people are the virus and the economy.
Thank you. And I'm going to move to Ramesh and just make a comment so everyone knows. Ramesh is going to have to leave the discussion at 9. I just checked to make sure that there were no questions directed specifically to him, and there aren't. But I'm going to let Ramesh share his lightning round comments on Biden at 100 days before he leaves.
Yeah, so sorry. This is a great conversation. So I think that one thing that's a little different, that maybe is a little abnormal in a way, is that we've had a long run of presidents now whose personalities have become a very, very top issue in American politics. I mean, that was the issue, really, in the case of Donald Trump for much of his presidency. And George W. Bush, he's a Bible thumping cowboy. He's ignorant. Obama's aloof. He's radical. Trump is Trump. But no sort of personal negative criticism about Biden right now is sticking. That, I think, doesn't mean he's in a totally politically commanding position 100 days in. I think there is some softness in his support. He doesn't, if you look at the polling, do you approve or do you strongly approve? There's a lot less strong approval than there typically is for a president. But it's just a very different kind of politics than we're used to. And I think in some ways, maybe we may be misreading some of the signs of where the public is, precisely because we are not used to a less personalized politics. When we've got a situation where Donald Trump, all he can come up with as an insult is to call him saintly Joe Biden, which I think is a clear example of a punch that doesn't land.
Thank you very much. Mark, how about you?
Yeah, I think Ramesh has it exactly right on that front, and I think the virus is going to be the issue that defines the rest of this year politically and culturally. And I think we are positioned. Obviously, things could go south again, but I think we're pretty well positioned. And we've seen just in the last 8 to 10 hours a storm of announcements of things opening up all over the country, and we're going to see more and more of that. And maybe it's a little bit too much too fast, but if you believe in the science, as we were urged to do over the last year, then you do have to open up, and I think that makes us poised to be a pretty happy country for a time. It doesn't mean a united country, so that happiness, I think, will do Joe Biden a lot of good, and he'll get some of the credit for that. But I think beneath that superficial happiness of people going out and celebrating and resuming their lives to one extent or another are extraordinary divisions that are not going away. And I think all you have to do is leave Washington and see the Trump signs all over the place, and you realize that unity is not the kind of bipartisanship and unity that Joe Biden talked about in the campaign is not in the cards, and the cultural war will remain even as we have this explosion of happiness. So the differences are deep, and as Newt Gingrich said the other day, one side is going to win eventually.
Thank you. So we're going to move into our audience questions now. And one of them is, of course, you haven't addressed the border. And actually, addressing the border was one of my questions. We just had such tremendous insights from the journalists joining us today that I didn't ask it. So now for you, I am going to ask it. As Biden pursues his overall agenda, the border and immigration loom as soft spots. Much of what Biden has proposed so far can be achieved without Republican support, but that's not true for immigration, a subject that Republican voters consider a priority and which Biden has not done much about. 53% of Americans say they disapprove of the way President Biden has dealt with the immigration situation at the US-Mexico border, and this is a problem that has vexed his administration for much of his first months. Today, the president changed his policies and announced that he's raising the refugee admission cap to 62,500. A reversal after he faced criticism over keeping the number at a Trump-era level of 15,000. Rick, how would you evaluate Biden's performance so far on the immigration issue?
I think it's been one of the spottiest, spottiest areas for that. I don't. It's to me still inexplicable how they didn't handle the refugee cap question better, or at least more elegantly. There's been stops and starts and reversals that have drawn critiques from the left, a lot of anger over it. In terms of the crisis at the border of recent months, there are elements of it that you can fairly blame on the weather or general circumstances. You also blame the fact that Biden is perceived as having a more humane border policy to drive some of that. But in any event, to not have anticipated that, not to see it coming. I also think there's been some issues in terms of accountability and press access that have been personal pet peeves for us. Broken promises around what we're able to see and when and how. It appears to be something that they were slow out of the gates on, to say the least. And the Biden team will tell you that they inherited something that was worse than they thought. They spent a lot of time trying to dig out from under policies that they thought needed eradication, utter reversal. And they didn't have the right people in place at the right times, which all of which are plausible enough explanations. But generally speaking, this is not, should not have been a big surprise to have had this as a crisis, or the refugee issue either, that people would be agitating and wanting more. We're still not at the state where things have been figured out. And I think the "we just got here" argument only holds for so long. And fundamentally, it's Biden's crisis now because he's the president. It's his responsibility. It's his administration that has to enact these policies. And clearly, they didn't pick this up as quickly as they probably should have.
Thank you. And thank you to our audience member who brought up this topic so we had a chance to address it, since it's certainly a very important one. So next question is, many argue that low interest rates mean that it's a great time to spend trillions, but given that we won't be running surpluses anytime soon, won't we be paying it back someday at a rate which could swallow the budget? Jennifer, what do you think about that one?
Well, I think that ultimately nobody's really thinking about paying it back ever. I mean, I think that's like the dirty little secret, is just that there is also a hope, I think, for this administration and the priorities that it's putting forward, that they will pay off and that you will fundamentally change the direction that the country is going in, and that you will lift people out of poverty with all of this spending, and that will boost tax revenue and will boost GDP and all those things, and that ultimately you will see just the whole country change course in a positive direction. And I think that there are a lot of ifs in that, but that I think that's where it is. And really, I think it goes back to something which has been touched on a little bit earlier, which is, Democrats knew that once they were in office again, and I saw there was a lot of this language on Twitter during the transition, as soon as the Republicans are okay with this deficit spending right now, and as soon as we take office, they're going to complain about it again, and lo and behold, that is what has happened here.
And there's a somewhat related question, which, Mark, I'm going to let you field, which is, if Biden wants to increase jobs and hold inflation in check, he should practice the economic policies of President Donald Trump. What do you think about that?
What we have is a situation where Trump benefited from good times and then got blamed for bad times. And now President Biden is going to preside over what appears to be a recovery that will pick up steam as people return to their regular lives. So that's always the case. Presidents always rise and fall based on the economy and the job situation. I think in this case, there's not much that Biden could do that would diminish a recovery at this point, and so I think we often overblow the role of presidents in those vicissitudes of the economy. That said, the spending plans that he has been pushing in recent days would have a significant economic impact, but as I said earlier, I don't expect that those will come to fruition. The bottom line is obviously he presents a very different style, manner, and philosophy from Trump, and I think that's what he'll be judged on. I think presidents, especially coming after any period of trauma, are judged on their ability to calm people and make them feel as if they are part of the society and that they have real hope and real prospects. And that is the challenge that Biden faces beyond the immediate one. How do you revive the American middle class? And he talked about that a lot in his speech the other day. And I think that once the immediate crisis of the virus is passed by, I think that will be the real test of his governing philosophy.
Thank you. So this question I'm going to direct to you, Rick. To what extent do you think that Biden is simply trying to capture the moment? The vaccine was well underway when he took office. The post-pandemic economy has only one direction to go. Isn't Biden really doing what Clinton did in 1993 by increasing taxes and spending on a growing economy because the economy can sustain both?
Sure, but I guess it's a bit like saying why did FDR act like a wartime president? Well, he had a war in the middle of his presidency. I mean, I feel like every president is elected in a particular moment in time. They're not elected in the abstract. And I think Joe Biden's had a 50-year career. He started running for president in 1988. He was elected in a particular moment with a particular set of challenges. If he was president from 1989 through 93 or 97, he would have been an entirely different president for an entirely different time. I think he's cognizant of that. I think that for the fact that he's been around as long as he has, knows that he's seen crises come and go, and he realizes how big a challenge these are. I think he talked about his own role as healing divisions. He talked about Charlottesville all the time in his campaign. Made the Derek Chauvin verdict a couple of weeks ago, poignant in its own way. There's just all of these different challenges. I think his agenda is meant to meet a particular moment. I don't think that makes him, though, unique in the annal of presidencies. I think presidents see opportunities in the moments that they greet, whether those are crises or peace, relative peace and prosperity, and which gives you other kinds of flexibility, or having big majorities or small, or needing to negotiate with the other side because you don't have a majority at all. I think Biden I think addresses and has addressed exactly where he is in history, where he sees himself in history, and that's kind of what you were going to get with him all along.
And as a corollary to that, and Jennifer, I'll have you answer this, one of our audience members says that in a way they feel like Biden is a wartime president due to the pandemic. How do we fairly judge him?
Well, I do think that is a frame that his team has used to some extent, and even the president himself has talked about vaccinations in that kind of and wearing a mask in that kind of a way. And that they do see this as that big crisis that they have to handle. And I think something else that it's sort of related to what Rick was saying is that Biden and his team, his top advisors, truly believe that he, went through to some, not that he was destined to be president in 2021 after a pandemic and an erratic president, but that his set of experiences from being vice president for 8 years to the first Black president, through nearly 4 decades in the Senate, that all of those things have made him uniquely suited to this moment, that his personality, his empathy, his, focus on dignity and respect of the individual, that all of those things kind of collide to make him the right force to come after Trump, and just to come at this moment in American history. And again, I don't think that there's a destiny sort of a thing here, but I do think they believe he is uniquely well suited for this moment, and that he is, and that yes, he could have been president some other time, but that this is the time when the country needed him most.
Thank you. And we have so many amazing questions in the Q&A, but we really only have time for one more. So I'm going to take the first one up, which is, what's the administration's perspective on rising violent crime rates? Is this lost in challenges of the pandemic, the economy, and foreign policy? Mark, what are your thoughts on this one?
It's an interesting question from my classmate, Van Wallach. It's obviously there has been an increase in homicides, in violent crimes in a number of American cities over the last year or two. At the same time, we have what I think all sides would agree is a crisis in policing in this country, whether it's the lack of trust from some communities or the crisis among police themselves. Just today, we had the announcement by the police union here in Washington that hundreds of officers have resigned in recent weeks because they don't think they're being supported, and they don't think they're safe in their work. So there's a tremendous morale problem among police officers, just as there is a tremendous mistrust problem of police officers in many places. And that has an impact on crime, presumably, if you believe that policing has anything to do with crime levels. But also there are underlying issues that are driving this resurgence of crime. That said, crime levels in this country are dramatically lower than they were 20, 30 years ago, and remain that way despite this recent increase. I think you'll see that while some conservatives are emphasizing that increase in crime for their political purposes, you'll also see that there are Democrats who are poo-pooing it because they say, well, look at it over the larger expanse of time, and this is perhaps a blip, or it's certainly not a return to what we saw in the 1960s and 70s. But crime is an issue. It's an emotional issue. It's one that's used politically by all sides and will continue to be. I think Biden has a history that he's trying to live down, of having been very tough on crime in ways that today are perceived as offensive or inappropriate. And so he's trying to appeal to the left of his party by saying, I'm not going to have that tough on crime aspect to my policies. That said, he has a vice president who made her career on being tough on crime. That's how she got elected in San Francisco. That's how she got elected in California. She now has a somewhat different tone to her statements about crime. We're in a place in the country where we have not settled on any one answer or direction, and I wouldn't expect, since we haven't settled on it as a people, I wouldn't expect that politicians in either party would have reasonable or clear answers either.
Thank you. And thank you to our audience for those tremendous questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them. And thank you, Jennifer, Mark, Rick, and also Ramesh, for taking the time to share your tremendous insights with us. This fabulous team of journalists has joined me in the past for talks, and I have to say, it's always wonderful to welcome you back and to hear your perspectives and your thoughts and insights. And I want to thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. Thank you also to the Princeton Association of New York City, my co-host Rob Wolk, and Conscious Capitalism New York City, the co-sponsors of tonight's program. And of course, to the Princeton Club, the main sponsor for tonight's program. The Princeton Club is recording this talk and will send everyone the link. We hope you'll join the Princeton Club for other interesting upcoming virtual events. Tomorrow night, we have another program in our Making a Difference series featuring the founder of Pencils of Promise, talking about the power of education around the world. On May 10th, George Will is going to join us again, this time for a discussion with Rob about baseball instead of politics. And we have more sustainability and conscious leadership programs coming up in June. So I really hope to see you there, and please stay tuned for these programs and other upcoming Princeton Club programs. Thank you again, Mark, Jennifer, Ramesh, and Rick for your insights and perspective. And thank you to everyone in our audience for joining us this evening. Stay well.
And thanks to Wendy for moderating. You did a great job tonight. It was wonderful to see all of you there.
Thank you so much.